Hee-Tae Jung, as well as my advisor, Shlomo Zilberstein. And just going to quickly apologize. This is the PDF backup, so all the fancy animations are going to be gone. You're just going to see flat slides. But I guess to go ahead and begin, just going to go over some quick background, because I know a few of these things are, at least over the past few days at ICAPS, people have been asking me about what certain words mean. So the one I'm pretty sure everyone knows about is planning, which is just the idea that if you have a problem that's represented by some initial state and some goal state, you want to find some sequence of actions that will get us from this initial state to the goal state. And as an example here, it's something sequential, but of course, it can also be partially ordered if there are some parts that can be done independently of one another. And from planning, plan recognition is sort of the inverse problem, where instead of knowing what the problem is, we want to find out what it was if we actually know the action sequence that was taken by an observed individual. Often, in the case of plan recognition, this is actually given already in strips or PDDL style notation, and we have a plan library that sort of dictates all the possible options that the observed agent could have taken. So in that case, as you can probably guess, hierarchical task networks do a pretty good job, where at the highest level we have what the overall plan would be. So for example, we have a morning routine, and that can be broken down into several things like waking up, brushing your teeth, and eating breakfast, and that can be broken down even further. And so what plan recognition would in this case ask is, if you observed an individual just turning off his alarm through cleaning the dishes, what exactly was the agent trying to do? And so obviously we can start looking up the tree, and we would eventually reach morning routine. And so obviously this looks like a parsing problem, and that's usually how it's done at the moment. And then otherwise there's also some statistical approaches, which we won't be focusing on too much today, but such ideas usually focus on the induction approach, and there's even some statistical relational methods that have been used. And in addition to plan recognition, there's also another form called activity recognition, which gets away from the idea that everything's already given in the higher level format, such as PDDL. And instead what we are usually given is some kind of sensor data, and of course sensors we know are usually noisy, and we have something that we can't really define, obviously as a PDDL style. And so this is usually used to figure out what was the actual action that was being performed, and then that can be used for the plan recognition later on. In this work, we do focus on activity recognition using RGB-D sensor, which is just your standard Connect, if you've probably seen that on your standard Xbox systems. And then the last thing, which is probably the newest part we're going to bring into the community, is the idea of the topic model. And so to explain sort of where this comes in, I think the best way to get into it is from thinking about the infinite monkey theorem, which says if you take a monkey and give him a typewriter in infinite time, you would eventually get the complete works of Shakespeare. And we can pretty much figure through this as just that if he has all his time and he keeps hitting random keys on the board, something eventually will give us a sequence of characters that is exactly what we'd expect out of a Shakespeare novel. And so the topic models are a generative model, which follows this idea and becomes the most generic making of story you could think of. So we're going to use LDA today, and that's the one I'll explain real quickly. But the idea is that you have some set of topics, and these topics are nothing more than a distribution over all the words in the language. So for example, if you were to think about something like cats and dogs being a very high probability out of all the words, then you'd probably think it's a topic about pets. And then, of course, these topics have some distribution present in each document. And then each of these documents thus has a section of the n-words within it. And we essentially derive these n-words by saying, well, let's from the distribution of the topics in this document, pick one out. And now we know what topic we want. We'll look at that same distribution over the words for the topic, and that's the word that we select. And if we do this over and over, we can actually get ourselves a very nice graphical model. And from the graphical model, we can very easily compute a probability of actually deriving that document, which would be the likelihood of the observations. So quick overview of what this would actually look like for a single document is right here. And it's a bag of words assumption because there's no structure or ordering. It's just a bunch of words in a document. And so how all this is going to come together is actually derived from some original work a few years ago at ICAPS by Gieb and Steedman, where they actually found a very close correlation between the method of the HTN and the grammar I was talking about earlier, where essentially each of the observed words in a document would sort of be like your observed actions. And then you can essentially use a parse tree just as you would use a hierarchical task network, and you can derive your rules for a pattern, which would be your plan library. This one, actually, as we said earlier with plan recognition, continues to assume your high order structure. And thus in our case, because we want to include activity recognition, which uses the sensor data, we've gone ahead and we've extended his work to propose a new analogy that essentially says that when we see our document, that's going to be some execution sequence. And in our case, the words are going to have to be individual poses of the observed individual through the connect sensor. The observations that we have organized are going to actually be our topics. And in this case, it'll be the action or the activity that's actually occurring. And thus, the tokens that we derive are going to be a distribution of topics becoming a distribution of the actions. So this isn't necessarily the first time something like this has been done. Work has been done in the past where people have actually used a supervised version of LDA. And thus, in the supervised version, they essentially already annotated the entire data set and said, this is the action that's occurring with these sensor readings. And then some work later on actually went into the unsupervised version, but they actually compressed a lot of the work into a bit vector, and then used PCA to reduce all this into a code book of about 600 unique symbols. And it worked really well, but the only problem, as I'll take a quote from their paper, was this method works extremely well as long as the features are not very different from the features that were used in their code book, which unfortunately means it's not very domain independent, and as soon as we went into a new domain, you would have new features that you didn't learn on before, and thus you have to start all over again with the whole learning process, and thus you don't have any continuation of your recognition model. And thus, combining those works, what we actually want to do is do something similar to what we saw earlier with LDA using our new analogy. So instead of the idea of the bag of words model here, what that means is we essentially take our action sequence and we just break it apart from a sequence into just a bag of actions. And thus our plan that we observe is now just essentially this distribution over various actions, and then each action has some distribution over poses. Hopefully you guys can see the little stick figures in the back. And so why is this necessary? Well, I guess as we've already gone over with a quick example from Sarah and Steve earlier today, we essentially are considering the ideas of human-robot interaction, where we're trying to study how to improve the immersion of robots into the world of our everyday lives. And so this means it needs to know what other humans are doing in order to accommodate to work with them. We have tons of different environments and scenarios to work in, and of course the robots have onboard sensors with real-time necessities for running the algorithm. And current plan recognition is not quite ready for this yet because it assumes the structured observations, as we talked about earlier. It needs the higher order representation, and at the moment, to accommodate that, it would usually use activity recognition as a wrapper. So it first finds all the actions, and then it pipes those into a plan recognition, and then it can pipe all that information into a planner, which, with real-time constraints, having to do all this piping is not necessarily the most optimal way to do this. And furthermore, we have the unpredictability of humans, which is probably the hardest factor to go with. Because, as we know, a human can do a plan and partial ordering, not knowing which way it's going to go. And likewise, anything could happen in the middle that wouldn't hinder the process of the action, like picking up your telephone and making a phone call in the middle of doing something. And these are essentially become noise in the action stream then. And all these things, if we were to account for them in our plan library, would just make it hugely intractable and very hard to work over. Thus, what we want to do is essentially combine the activity and the plan recognition to a single module. And thus, in order to work with it, we need to look at RGB data as text. So to do this, we just essentially take some joint angles, which is a very common method in robotics for taking all the joints in the body and then finding some vectors from each of the joints to connect them all together. And in order to compress this so we actually have distributions over words and not a bunch of real number sequences, which are very hard to find duplicates of, and without duplicates you have no distribution other than uniform, we just go ahead and we break it down into various granularities. We'll get into granularities in a moment. But when we break them down, the granularities look like they scale up quite quickly as well and would give us many, many tokens as well. But if we think about the fact that the human postures are actually limited in how much they can bend by kinematics, we actually do find out the vocabularies are actually limited enough to be used with many duplicates, just like how we have a lot of possible strings of characters and letters of the alphabet, but only some of them make actual words. So the important thing to notice with granularities is an interesting thing that we found is, if you notice, when we have an even number of breaking down the interval, we get many unique ones and very few duplicates, while if we break it down to an odd number, we actually get quite a few duplicates. And this actually confused us for a while, until I guess some of the guys in the robotics lab who work on the kinematics pointed out that when we look at our interval, if you have an even number, you're actually breaking it down right here on 0, and 0 degrees is essentially right here in the center of the body. So if you're watching an ordinary human who's just standing still, there'll be natural arm oscillations actually in the body. And just arms naturally swinging back and forth actually creates two different granularities and thus two different classifications for all these. So in the representation scheme, we actually find out that there's a lot of things that have to be considered because naturally if the person is standing still and his arm's just sliding a little bit left and right, that should actually be considered a single word. And so we focus from here on with odd granularities, and in particular in the mid-30s and low 20s seem to give us the right amount of words for our vocabulary in our data set. And thus, after running LDA with all the parameter settings that any machine learning method requires, we have to start to find out that choosing the number of topics, because LDA is unsupervised, also plays a role. So most important things to notice is when you do not give yourself enough topics, you actually start to have, just by pigeonholing, a lot of duplicate, you essentially cluster a bunch of irrelevant actions together. In this case, we can actually see we have some that we've colored red, some green, and some black. All of them look pretty different and don't have much in common. Well, on the other hand, if we have too many, we actually start to see that in the case where this should have been an all-green topic and this should have been an all-red topic, there were so many of them that they just happened to spill into each other and essentially pull apart topics that really should have been combined together into one. And so we have a little bit of overlap here. However, when the settings are correct, we actually can find that nicely enough, it really pulls out these distributions that we were hoping to find. So we've just pulled a few here where if you look at the individual's right arm, we'll need to reorder them because this is just the most likely in the distribution to less likely as we go further down. The right arm here has various poses that actually mimic the throwing action. Here we can actually see by the way the legs are bent and the fact the arms are moving back and forth, we can start to see a little bit of walking here. The legs here are bending up and down as in the jumping, and here we have arms raised in various positions. So we actually start to find these, from these pose data, we can actually see that these topics, which we wanted to be actions, are actually encoding these higher level interpretations, which essentially could be then used as PDDL sort of things. And even at this point, the fact that these are the topics then tells us that when we have an observed execution sequence, we can actually find the distribution of how present each of these topics are and thus get an idea of what the plan should be. But unfortunately, while this is great, we got to say nothing's perfect. And so this method looks great, but by itself, it's not quite enough to do what we need to do with human-robot interaction. So getting into the ideas of future work, we'll just note that LDA itself, as an unsupervised method, being unsupervised just means that every time we run it, we don't know what it's going to give us. So it, as you could see, sometimes 15 topics was good, sometimes it was bad, as two of my examples showed. And so we need to find a way to maybe have better control over this. And also the lack of prediction, which we were complaining about earlier with the essentially the compression into the 600 different tokens. Right now, we would just classify them all as a single unknown token, which is what's commonly done in LDA for document modeling. And lastly, the bag of words assumption is good, but I'm sure people here are going to say it's a sequence of actions for a reason. Things should occur one before another, and so we need some temporal information back. And also, the fact that we're not considering other objects in the environment of what we're dealing with gives us very little context, and thus, the idea of here or there doesn't really tell us very much. And so the fact that we can't recognize loop plans or that we can't really tell what's going on in the environment is going to be the source of our first inspiration, that we hope to modify LDA in order to have more structural information in the future. We also then, of course, as you extend these models, it'll make them take a longer time to run, and thus we need to handle the real-time constraint that will probably be put harder on us, because right now it runs very quickly, but as you make models more complex, they take longer to run. And thus, there's some work that's already optimized the process, and then also anytime inference methods can be helpful. And then lastly, as we continue to improve everything, we hope to do further testing. Right now, we've done this on a very small data set just to make sure things look like it was promising at the very beginning. And of course, actually doing work in a human-robot trial is going to be necessary in order to make sure that this will actually work in the human-robot environments. And with that, I'd just like to go ahead and quickly thank everyone in my lab for all their help and support as we've gotten started with this project, as well as my collaborator Hee-Tae and everyone in the robotics lab who has also done equally well with all the support. And thank all of you all for being here today.
Questions?
Thanks. So your pitch role have a known problem with the discontinuity, right, after 180 degrees. Mm-hmm. And the typical solution for that, at least in robotics, is using quaternions. Have you tried using that representation instead and seeing if it might possibly be better?
No, and that's actually a very good point. Having done some work with graphics, I agree. Quaternions is much more efficient. And at the moment, I guess we're still playing around with the representations. We definitely do want to work with the skeleton model. And so perhaps actually the Connect-A does return homogeneous transformations in the first place. So that would be the quaternion. So you may be correct that maybe it's better not even to try to convert the raw data as long as it doesn't get too large in the space that then it's hard to find the duplicate distributions, as we were saying earlier.
So, 2 points, 2 comments actually for thinking in the future. One, in language, topic modeling tools, LDA, and more advanced tools like tensor decomposition-based tools these days they assume that the text was generated by a generative model. And the sequence in which things are generated by this generator doesn't matter. Like it's IID sample from this source, right?
Right.
If it is an activity like walking, then, well, still, there is a sequence of things happening, and they will not happen in different order. So I think that this aspect is very special in case of activities, and it's not present in text, should be exploited in some way.
Yes, and actually I do agree with that. As we said before, the sequentiality is something we will need to incorporate back in. And
okay.
Yeah, and actually one possible model that may be helpful, I'm not sure if you're familiar with, it was a 2004 NIPS paper by most people in Tenenbaum's lab, but there's a composite model which actually essentially is a hidden Markov model, but it calls LDA when it believes there should be a semantic thing, and otherwise uses temporality with just your basic HMM. So that may actually be what you were saying with the walking, you will have the continuation, and then when it's something really unique like a walking topic, after we transition into it, then it would call out to the LDA model to find those special poses. We'd like to try that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you again.